I will never forget the moment I pushed open that rotting wooden door and stepped inside the cabin for the first time. My little brother Tommy was shivering behind me, his small hand gripping the back of my jacket so tight I could feel his fingernails through the fabric. We had been walking for 6 hours. 6 hours through rain that felt like ice against our skin. 6 hours with nothing but a backpack filled with clothes I had grabbed in a panic and $47 stuffed into my sock. That was everything we had in the world. Tommy was only 7 years old. I was 16. And somewhere behind us, maybe 20 miles back, was a house that was supposed to be our home. A house where our stepmother had stood in the doorway that very morning and told us we were no longer welcome. A house where our father lay in a hospital bed miles away, fighting for his life after a car accident, completely unaware that his wife had just thrown his children out onto the street. When I saw that cabin sitting in the middle of nowhere, hidden by overgrown trees and looking like it hadn't been touched in decades, I thought it was just a place to survive the night. Just 4 walls and a roof to keep my little brother from getting hypothermia. I had no idea that walking through that door would change absolutely everything about our lives. I had no idea what we would find inside. And I definitely had no idea about the secret that cabin had been keeping for over 40 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. Let me tell you how my brother and I ended up homeless at the ages of 16 and 7. Let me tell you about the day everything fell apart. My name is Sarah, and growing up, I always believed that family was the one thing you could count on no matter what. That belief came from my mother, who passed away when I was 11 years old. She was the kind of woman who made our small house feel like the warmest, safest place in the entire world. She would bake cookies every Sunday, not because it was a special occasion, but just because she loved seeing me and Tommy smile. She would read us stories at night, doing all the different voices until we were laughing so hard we couldn't breathe. She made ordinary days feel magical. When she got sick, everything changed. The doctors said it was cancer, the aggressive kind that spreads fast and doesn't give you much time. She fought for 8 months. 8 months of hospital visits and treatments that made her hair fall out and stole the light from her eyes. 8 months of watching the strongest woman I had ever known become weaker and weaker until one morning, she just didn't wake up. I was 11, Tommy was only 2. He doesn't remember her at all, not really. Sometimes I'll catch him looking at photographs of her and he'll ask me what her voice sounded like or what her hugs felt like. Those questions break my heart every single time because I know I can never truly make him understand what we lost. I can describe her laugh all I want, but he'll never actually hear it. I can tell him about her warmth, but he'll never actually feel it. After Mom died, Dad did his best. He really did. He was a construction worker, which meant long hours and hard physical labor. He would come home exhausted, covered in dust and sweat, but he always made time for us. He learned to braid my hair even though his thick, calloused fingers struggled with the delicate work. He learned to cook basic meals even though everything he made tasted slightly burnt. He showed up to every school event, every parent-teacher conference, every silly little play I was in. He was trying so hard to be both mother and father to us. But loneliness is a powerful thing. Grief does strange things to people. About 3 years after Mom passed, Dad started dating again. I understood, even though part of me resented it. He deserved to be happy. He deserved to have someone to share his life with. I told myself I would be supportive. I told myself I would give whoever this woman was a fair chance. Then I met Linda. Linda was nothing like my mother. Where my mother had been soft and warm, Linda was sharp and cold. She had perfectly manicured nails painted dark red, and she always looked at our house like it was beneath her. She worked as an office manager at some big company downtown, and she made more money than my father did. She made sure everyone knew it too. At first she pretended to like us. When Dad was around, she would smile at me and Tommy, ask us about school, offer to help with homework. But the second Dad left the room, her smile would drop. Her eyes would go flat and empty. She would look at us the way someone looks at a stain on their carpet, something unpleasant that needed to be dealt with. I tried to tell Dad. I tried to explain that something was off about her, that she treated us differently when he wasn't watching, but he was so happy. For the first time since Mom died, he was genuinely happy. His eyes would light up when he talked about her. He would hum while making breakfast, something he hadn't done in years. How could I take that away from him? So I kept quiet. I told myself it would get better once she got to know us. I told myself that maybe I was just being paranoid, still protective of my mother's memory. They got married when I was 14. It was a small ceremony at the courthouse, just a few friends and family members. I stood there in an uncomfortable dress Linda had picked out for me, watching my father slip a ring onto another woman's finger. Tommy held my hand the entire time, too young to fully understand what was happening, but sensing that something big was changing. After the wedding, Linda moved into our house, and that's when things really started to go downhill. The first thing she did was redecorate. She threw away Mom's curtains, the ones with the little yellow flowers that Mom had sewn herself. She replaced our worn but comfortable furniture with sleek modern pieces that looked expensive but felt cold. She took down the family photos that hung in the hallway and replaced them with abstract art that meant nothing to anyone. I came home from school one day to find her boxing up Mom's things. Clothes, jewellery, books, all the little pieces of my mother that we had kept around the house to remember her by. Linda said she was just cleaning out clutter. She said it wasn't healthy for us to cling to the past. She said we needed to move forward. I begged Dad to stop her. I cried and pleaded and told him that those things were all we had left. He looked torn, caught between his new wife and his grieving daughter. In the end, he compromised. He let me keep a small box of Mom's most precious belongings, but everything else went to donation. I hated Linda for that. I hated her with every fibre of my being, but I learned to hide it. I learned to smile and nod and pretend everything was fine because fighting only made things worse. Fighting only made Dad upset, and I couldn't stand to see the pain in his eyes when he felt torn between us. Linda's true nature came out gradually, like poison seeping slowly into water. She would criticize everything I did. My grades were never good enough, even when I brought home straight A's. My clothes were too sloppy, too childish, too attention-seeking. My friends were bad influences. My hobbies were wastes of time. Nothing I did was ever right in her eyes. But she saved her worst treatment for Tommy. Maybe it was because he wasn't old enough to fight back. Maybe it was because he needed more attention and care than I did. Whatever the reason, she treated him like an inconvenience, like a burden she had been unfairly saddled with. She would forget to pack his lunch for school. She would leave him waiting for hours when she was supposed to pick him up. She would snap at him for the smallest things, for being too loud, for making a mess, for asking too many questions. He was just a little kid. He didn't deserve any of it. I became his protector. I made sure he had lunch by packing it myself. I walked him home from school so he wouldn't have to wait for her. I dried his tears when she made him cry and told him that none of this was his fault. I tried to shield him from the worst of her cruelty. Dad was oblivious to most of it. He worked long hours, sometimes leaving before we woke up and coming home after we went to bed. When he was home, Linda put on her act. She was sweet and attentive and caring. She would ruffle Tommy's hair and ask about my day, and Dad would beam at her like she was an angel sent from heaven. It made me sick, but what could I do? I was just a kid myself. The years passed and the situation only got worse. Linda became more emboldened, less careful about hiding her disdain for us. She would make comments about how expensive we were, how much of Dad's money we consumed. She would sigh loudly whenever we asked for anything. Whether it was new school supplies or money for a field trip, she made us feel like parasites feeding off her generosity. By the time I turned 16, I had learned to survive. I got a part-time job at a grocery store after school, saving every penny I could. I had a secret bank account that Linda didn't know about. I had a plan. In 2 years, when I turned 18, I would take Tommy and leave. I would get a job, find an apartment, file for guardianship of my brother. We would escape. But fate had other plans. The accident happened on a Thursday evening in October. Dad was driving home from work when a truck ran a red light and slammed into the driver's side of his car. The impact was so severe that they had to use specialized equipment to cut him out of the wreckage. He was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, with injuries that the doctors described as life-threatening. I remember exactly where I was when I got the call. I was in my room doing homework when Linda's phone rang downstairs. I heard her gasp, then silence, then the sound of her car keys jingling. She left without telling us anything, just walked out the front door and drove away. It wasn't until 2 hours later that she called to tell me what had happened. Even then, her voice was flat and emotionless. She said Dad was in surgery. She said it was bad. She said I should stay home and take care of Tommy. Then she hung up. The next few days were a blur of fear and uncertainty. Dad survived the surgery, but he was in a coma. The doctors couldn't tell us when or if he would wake up. They said his brain had swelled from the impact, and they were doing everything they could to reduce the pressure. They said we should hope for the best but prepare for the worst. Linda visited the hospital every day, playing the role of devoted wife for the medical staff and any family friends who stopped by. But at home, her mask slipped completely. She stopped pretending to care about us at all. She barely spoke to us. She didn't cook dinner or help with homework or do any of the things a guardian was supposed to do. We fended for ourselves. 3 weeks after the accident, Dad was still in a coma. The hospital bills were piling up. Linda was becoming more agitated by the day, stressed about money and responsibilities and a husband who might never wake up. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Saturday morning in late November. The weather had turned cold, with grey skies and a bitter wind that promised rain. I was making breakfast for Tommy when Linda came downstairs with a strange look on her face. She was already dressed, her makeup perfect, her hair styled like she was going somewhere important. She sat down at the kitchen table and stared at us for a long moment without saying anything. Tommy noticed and stopped eating his cereal, looking at her with those big brown eyes of his, the same eyes our mother had. Then Linda spoke. Her voice was calm and cold, like she was discussing the weather or making plans for grocery shopping. She said that things couldn't continue the way they were. She said that with Dad in the hospital and the bills piling up, she couldn't afford to take care of 2 children who weren't even hers. She said that she had made some calls, and there was a group home that had space for us, a place for kids without parents. I felt my stomach drop. A group home. She wanted to send us to a group home like we were unwanted dogs being dropped at a shelter. I started to argue. I told her she couldn't do that. I told her that Dad would never agree to it. I told her that we had family, even though we didn't really, even though my father had been an only child and my mother's relatives lived across the country and had never been close. Linda just shrugged. She said that Dad wasn't able to make decisions right now. She said that as his wife, she had the authority to do what was best for the household. She said that the group home would come to pick us up on Monday and we should start packing. I don't know what happened next. I don't know what switch flipped inside me. But suddenly I was yelling. Screaming, really. All the years of hatred and frustration came pouring out in a flood of angry words. I called her every name I could think of. I accused her of never loving us, of never even trying to be part of our family, of just waiting for an opportunity to get rid of us. Linda's face went red with rage. She stood up so fast her chair fell over behind her, and then she said the words that I will never forget as long as I live. She said that she wasn't going to wait until Monday. She said she wanted us out of her house right now. She said she didn't care where we went or what we did, but we had 1 hour to pack our things and leave. I laughed. I actually laughed because I thought she was bluffing. She couldn't just throw 2 children out on the street. That was illegal. That was insane. But Linda wasn't bluffing. She went upstairs and came back down with garbage bags. She started throwing our belongings into them, not even bothering to fold anything or be careful with our possessions. She grabbed Tommy's favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear that had belonged to our mother, and threw it across the room. That's when Tommy started crying. Something about seeing my little brother in tears, terrified and confused and clutching for that teddy bear, made me realize that this was actually happening. Linda was actually kicking us out, and if I didn't do something fast, we were going to end up on the street with nothing. I grabbed a backpack and started shoving things into it. Important things, clothes, toiletries, the small box of Mom's belongings that I had kept hidden in my closet. I grabbed my secret stash of money from its hiding place under my mattress. I grabbed chargers and identification documents and anything else I could think of. Tommy was still crying, not understanding what was happening or why. I knelt down beside him and held his face in my hands. I looked into his eyes and told him that everything was going to be okay. I told him that I would take care of him. I told him to trust me. He nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks. Then he grabbed his teddy bear and held it tight against his chest. We were out of the house within the hour. Linda slammed the door behind us without even saying goodbye. And just like that, we were homeless. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, staring at the house where I had grown up. The house where my mother had lived and laughed and loved us. The house where I had taken my first steps and lost my first tooth and cried myself to sleep after my mother died. It had never felt like home after Linda moved in, but it was still ours. It was still all we knew. Now it was gone. Tommy tugged on my sleeve. He asked where we were going to go. His voice was small and scared, and it broke my heart. I didn't have an answer. I didn't have a plan. Everything I had been working toward, saving money and waiting until I was 18, it was all meaningless now. I was 16 years old with $47 in my sock, a backpack full of random belongings, and a 7-year-old brother depending on me to figure out what to do next. I thought about calling the police. I thought about reporting Linda for child abandonment. But then I thought about what would happen next. The cops would get involved. Social services would get involved. Tommy and I would be separated, put into different foster homes, torn apart from each other. I couldn't let that happen. We were all each other had left. So I made a decision. We would figure this out on our own. We would survive, just the two of us, until Dad woke up from his coma and could take us back. The first thing I needed to do was find somewhere safe to spend the night. It was already getting cold, and the sky was heavy with clouds that threatened rain. I couldn't let Tommy sleep outside. He was just a little kid. He would get sick. I thought about people we could call, friends from school whose parents might take us in. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I didn't have those kinds of friendships. I had been so busy working and taking care of Tommy and surviving Linda's hostility that I hadn't made close connections with anyone. I was alone. There was one option. My mother's sister, Aunt Clara, lived about 4 hours away by bus. We hadn't seen her in years, not since Mom's funeral, but she had always been kind to us. Maybe she would take us in. Maybe she would help. I used some of my precious money to buy bus tickets. The ride was long and uncomfortable. Tommy fell asleep against my shoulder, exhausted from crying, while I stared out the window and tried not to panic about our situation. We arrived at Aunt Clara's town late in the afternoon. I didn't have her exact address, just a vague memory of the neighborhood where she lived. We wandered the streets for hours, asking strangers if they knew a woman named Clara Bennett, getting strange looks and unhelpful answers. Eventually we found the house. Or what used to be the house. It was empty, for sale sign in the front yard, windows dark, garden overgrown. I asked a neighbor what had happened. She told me that Clara had moved to Florida 6 months ago. She didn't have a forwarding address. Another dead end. By this point it was getting dark, and the rain that had been threatening all day finally arrived. Not a gentle rain, but a cold, driving downpour that soaked through our clothes within minutes. Tommy was shivering. His lips were turning blue. We needed shelter, and we needed it fast. I made the decision to start walking toward the edge of town, away from the main roads and prying eyes. I didn't know what I was looking for. A barn, maybe, an abandoned building, anything with a roof. We walked for hours. The rain didn't let up. My feet were blistered and aching. Tommy was barely able to keep going, stumbling with every step, crying quietly because he was too exhausted to cry loudly. And then I saw it. Through the trees, barely visible in the fading light, was a shape that didn't belong to the forest. It was a cabin, small and worn, with a sagging roof and walls that were more grey than brown. The windows were dark, the yard completely overgrown with weeds and fallen branches. It looked like no one had been there in years. I told Tommy to wait while I investigated. He clutched my sleeve and begged me not to leave him alone. So we went together, pushing through the overgrown bushes, stepping over fallen logs, making our way toward what I hoped would be our salvation for the night. The door was unlocked. Actually, the lock was broken, rusted through and hanging uselessly from the frame. I pushed it open, and the hinges screamed in protest, a sound that echoed through the silent forest. Inside, it was dark and dusty and smelled like mold and forgotten things. But it was dry, it was shelter, and right now that was all that mattered. I led Tommy inside and closed the door behind us, blocking out the wind and rain. We stood there in the darkness, dripping wet, listening to the sound of our own breathing. I pulled out my phone to use as a flashlight. The battery was almost dead, but it gave us enough light to see our surroundings. The cabin was small, just one main room with a tiny kitchen area off to one side and what looked like a bathroom through a narrow doorway. The furniture was old and covered in dust, a couch with stuffing coming out of the cushions, a wooden table with 3 chairs, a bookshelf that had collapsed at some point and spilled its contents across the floor. Against the back wall was a fireplace, and next to it, a stack of old newspapers and what looked like dried wood. Hope flickered in my chest. If I could get a fire going, we could warm up and dry our clothes. I found matches in one of the kitchen drawers. They were old but still worked. I spent the next 20 minutes coaxing a flame from the old newspapers and kindling, blowing on it gently, feeding it larger pieces of wood until we had a real fire crackling in the hearth. The warmth was incredible. Tommy and I huddled close to the flames, stripping off our wet outer layers and wrapping ourselves in dusty blankets I found in a closet. For the first time all day, we were warm. Tommy fell asleep almost immediately, curled up on the old couch with his teddy bear pressed against his chest. I watched the firelight dance across his face and felt a fierce protectiveness surge through me. I would keep him safe. No matter what it took, I would keep my brother safe. I stayed awake for hours, watching the fire, listening to the rain pound against the roof, thinking about what we were going to do next. We couldn't stay here forever. We needed food, we needed money, we needed a real plan. But for tonight we were alive. For tonight we were together. That was enough. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the dirty windows and birds were singing outside. The rain had stopped. The fire had died down to embers, and Tommy was still sleeping peacefully beside me. I got up quietly, trying not to wake him. In the light of day, the cabin looked even worse than it had the night before. Everything was covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. The floor was warped in places, and I could see gaps where the boards had rotted away. But the structure itself seemed solid. The roof had only a few small leaks and the walls were intact. I started exploring more carefully. The kitchen had an old wood-burning stove that looked like it might still work. The cabinets were empty except for a few rusted cans with labels so faded I couldn't read them. The bathroom had a pump-style sink that actually produced water when I worked the handle, though I wasn't sure if it was safe to drink. Then I found the cellar. There was a trapdoor in the floor near the back of the cabin, partially hidden by a fallen bookshelf. I almost missed it entirely, but something about the way the floor looked different there caught my attention. I moved the debris aside and found an iron ring set into the wood. My heart started beating faster. I don't know why I felt so nervous about a simple cellar. Maybe it was because this cabin clearly had secrets. Maybe it was because everything about this situation felt like something out of a fairy tale, the dark kind where children get lost in the woods and have to survive on their own. I pulled on the iron ring. The trapdoor was heavy, swollen with moisture and age, but eventually it gave way with a groan. Below was a wooden ladder leading down into darkness. I grabbed my phone, which I had managed to charge a little bit using the last of its battery before it died, and used the flashlight to peer into the cellar. It looked deep, maybe 8 or 10 feet. The floor appeared to be dirt. I should have waited, I should have been more careful, but something was pulling me down there, some instinct or curiosity that I couldn't explain. I climbed down the ladder, one rung at a time, until my feet touched the cold earth below. The cellar was larger than I expected. It extended under the entire cabin, with rough stone walls and wooden support beams. The air was cold and damp, smelling of earth and something else, something metallic. My flashlight swept across the space, illuminating shelves lined with dusty jars, old tools hanging from hooks, boxes stacked in corners. It looked like a normal cellar at first, the kind you'd find under any old country house. Then the light fell on something else. In the far corner of the cellar, behind a stack of wooden crates, was a metal box. Not just any metal box, but a safe. A proper safe, the kind with a combination lock and heavy-duty construction. It was about the size of a large microwave, and even under the layers of dust and grime, I could see that it was made of quality materials. My heart was pounding now. Why would someone leave a safe in an abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere? What was inside it? I tried the handle, locked of course. The combination dial was stuck, rusted in place. I tried turning it, but it wouldn't budge. I was so focused on the safe that I almost missed the other thing, the thing that would change everything. It was a letter, actually. An envelope, yellowed with age, sitting on top of the safe like it had been left there deliberately, like someone wanted it to be found. I picked it up carefully, afraid it might crumble in my hands. The envelope was addressed to no one, but there was a name written on the back. A name that made my blood run cold. Benjamin Walker. That was my father's name. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the envelope, unable to process what I was seeing. Why would my father's name be on a letter in an abandoned cabin that I had found by pure chance? It didn't make any sense. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in faded ink. The date at the top was from over 40 years ago. The letter was from a man named Robert Walker. My grandfather, the grandfather I had never met, who had died before I was born, who my father rarely talked about. The letter was addressed to anyone who might find it, and what it said changed everything. It explained that Robert Walker had built this cabin himself in the 1970s. He had used it as a retreat from the world, a place to escape the pressures of his life and focus on what truly mattered. But it was also something else. It was a hiding place. Robert Walker, my grandfather, had been a successful businessman. He had owned a chain of hardware stores across 3 states, back when such things could make a man wealthy. But he had also been paranoid about banks and the government, convinced that at any moment everything could be taken away. So he had hidden his money, not all of it but a significant portion, enough to ensure that his family would be taken care of if everything went wrong. The letter explained that the safe in the cellar contained cash and gold coins that Robert had been accumulating since the 1960s. He had planned to tell his son, my father, about the cabin and the safe when the time was right. But he never got the chance. He died of a heart attack in 1985, taking the secret with him. The letter also contained the combination to the safe. 3 numbers, written in neat handwriting at the bottom of the page. I stood in that cold, dark cellar for a long time, holding the letter, trying to understand what was happening. My grandfather had left behind a hidden fortune. My father had never known about it. And now, by some impossible coincidence, I had stumbled upon it while running away from my stepmother. It didn't feel real. It felt like a dream or a story, like something that happened to other people but never to you. But there was only one way to find out if it was real. I approached the safe. I worked at the combination dial until it loosened enough to turn. Then, holding my breath, I entered the 3 numbers from the letter. There was a click, the safe door swung open. The first thing I saw was money. Stacks and stacks of bills, bundled together with rubber bands that had turned brittle with age. I pulled out a bundle and examined it. $100 bills. Old ones from the 1970s and 80s but still legal tender. Beneath the cash were small pouches. I opened one and found gold coins. American gold eagles and Krugerrands, dozens of them, gleaming in the light of my flashlight despite the dust. There was more, documents, property deeds, old stock certificates. A smaller envelope containing my grandfather's will, which left everything to his only son, Benjamin Walker. I sat down on the dirt floor of the cellar and started to cry. I don't know how long I sat there, surrounded by my grandfather's hidden fortune, sobbing like a child. All the stress and fear and exhaustion of the past few weeks came pouring out of me. I cried for my mother who was gone forever. I cried for my father, who was lying in a hospital bed fighting for his life. I cried for Tommy, who was upstairs sleeping in an abandoned cabin because the woman who was supposed to take care of us had thrown us away like garbage. But I also cried with relief, because we weren't going to die out here in the woods. We weren't going to starve or freeze to death. We had options now. We had hope. Eventually, I pulled myself together. I dried my eyes and started thinking practically. I couldn't just walk into a bank with 40-year-old $100 bills and bags of gold coins. That would raise too many questions. I needed to be smart about this. I also needed to take care of some immediate concerns. Tommy and I needed food. We needed supplies. We needed to stay hidden until I could figure out our next steps. I took a few $100s from the safe, choosing the bills that looked the least old and worn. I closed the safe and carefully climbed back up the ladder, replacing the trapdoor and the debris that had hidden it. Tommy was awake when I emerged into the main room. He was sitting up on the couch, clutching his teddy bear, looking around with wide, frightened eyes. I told him everything was going to be okay. I told him I had found something that would help us. I told him we were going to be fine. He looked at me with those big brown eyes and asked if we could go home now. I pulled him into a hug and told him that we would make a new home, a better home, and nobody would ever take it away from us. Over the next few days, I focused on survival and planning. I made trips into the nearest town, which was about 5 miles away through the forest. I bought food and supplies with the old money, getting strange looks from shopkeepers who had never seen bills that old but accepting them nonetheless. I also started researching. The library in town had computers with internet access, and I spent hours learning about our situation. I learned about child emancipation, about guardianship laws, about what rights I had as a 16-year-old with no parents available to care for me. I learned about gold dealers and how to sell precious metals without raising red flags. I learned about inheritance laws and how to prove that my father was the rightful heir to my grandfather's estate. The more I learned, the more I realized how complicated our situation was. But the more I learned, the more I also realized that we had a chance. A real chance. I also called the hospital every day using a payphone in town, asking about my father's condition. The news was always the same. He was stable but still in a coma. The doctors were hopeful but couldn't make any promises. Each call was both a relief and a disappointment. About a week after we found the cabin, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. Someone came. I heard the car before I saw it. The sound of an engine getting closer, cutting through the forest silence. I grabbed Tommy and pulled him toward the back of the cabin, my mind racing through escape routes and hiding spots. But the car didn't go past, it stopped, right outside the cabin. I peered through a crack in the boarded-up window and saw an old pickup truck. The driver's door opened, and a man got out. He was maybe 60 years old, with grey hair and weathered skin, and the kind of work clothes that suggested he spent his life outdoors. He stood there for a moment, looking at the cabin, looking at the smoke coming from the chimney. Then he started walking toward the door. I didn't know what to do. We had been so careful, trying not to be seen, trying not to leave traces. But the fire produced smoke, and smoke could be seen for miles. I had been stupid, careless. The man knocked on the door, 3 solid knocks, then silence. I held my breath. Tommy was shaking beside me. Neither of us moved. Another knock, then the man's voice calling out. He said he didn't mean any harm. He said he saw the smoke and wanted to make sure everything was okay. He said he used to know the man who built this cabin. That last part made me freeze. He knew my grandfather. Before I could think it through, I found myself moving toward the door. Tommy grabbed my arm, trying to hold me back, but I gently pulled free. Something told me this was important. Something told me I needed to talk to this man. I opened the door. The man looked at me with surprise. Whatever he had been expecting, it wasn't a 16-year-old girl with dirty hair and a frightened expression. He asked if I was okay. He asked where my parents were. He asked what I was doing out here all alone. I could have lied, I should have lied, but I was tired of lying, tired of hiding, tired of carrying this burden all by myself. So I told him the truth, all of it. I told him about my mother dying and my father remarrying. I told him about Linda and her cruelty. I told him about the accident and the coma and being thrown out with nowhere to go. I told him about finding the cabin by chance and discovering the cellar and the safe. I told him about my grandfather's letter. The man listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then he said his name was George Miller. He said he had been my grandfather's best friend. He said he had helped Robert build this very cabin back in 1973. He said he had wondered for 40 years what had happened to Robert's fortune and why his son, my father, had never claimed the property. I asked him why. Why hadn't my father known about any of this? George explained that Robert had been planning to tell my father everything on his 18th birthday. But Robert died 3 months before that birthday. The secret died with him. The lawyers who handled the estate hadn't known about the cabin or the safe. My father had inherited the hardware stores, but they had failed during the recession of the late 1980s. He had never known he had another inheritance waiting for him. George asked if he could see the letter. I hesitated, but something about the old man made me trust him. I retrieved it from the cellar and showed it to him. He read it slowly, his eyes getting wet as he went. When he finished, he looked at me and said that Robert would have been proud. He said that out of all the people in the world, his own great-grandchildren had found their way back to this place. He said that must have been more than coincidence. I didn't know what to say to that. I didn't believe in fate or destiny or any of that. But I also couldn't explain how Tommy and I had ended up at this specific cabin, built by our own grandfather, containing the solution to all our problems. It was too strange to be random chance. George offered to help us. He said he had legal contacts. People who could help us navigate the complicated situation we were in. He said he had connections to gold dealers who could give us a fair price for the coins without asking too many questions. He said he had a spare bedroom at his house where we could stay while we figured things out. I didn't accept right away. I had learned not to trust adults. But over the next few days, George proved himself. He brought us food and supplies. He helped me fix some of the worst problems with the cabin. He answered my questions honestly and never asked for anything in return. Eventually, I started to believe that he was genuine, that he really did care about us because of his friendship with our grandfather, that not every adult in the world was like Linda. We moved into George's house about 2 weeks after we first arrived at the cabin. He had a comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood with a real bed and a hot shower and a kitchen full of food. After weeks of roughing it in the woods, it felt like heaven. George immediately got to work helping us with our situation. He contacted a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chen who specialized in family law and estate issues. She reviewed the documents from the safe and confirmed that my father was indeed the legal heir to my grandfather's estate, including the cabin and everything in it. Since my father was incapacitated, and since his wife had abandoned his children, there were grounds for an emergency guardianship arrangement. The legal process took months. There were hearings and paperwork and interviews with social workers. Linda tried to contest it at first, claiming that she had never kicked us out, that we had run away. But George testified about finding us in the cabin, alone and frightened. Patricia presented evidence of Linda's neglect and the fact that she had made no effort to find us after we left. In the end, the court granted temporary guardianship to George, with a provision that it would transfer to my father upon his recovery. Linda was ordered to have no contact with us. She didn't even fight that part. I think she was relieved to be rid of us for good. The money from the safe was more complicated. We couldn't just spend it freely without drawing attention. Patricia helped us set up a trust fund that would manage the assets until I turned 18. Some of the gold was sold through legitimate dealers, providing enough cash for our immediate needs. The rest was kept in secure storage, waiting for the proper time. All told, my grandfather's hidden fortune was worth nearly $2 million. Not enough to make us rich, but more than enough to secure our future. But the money wasn't even the most important thing that happened. 4 months after I found the cabin, my father woke up from his coma. I was at school when I got the call. The hospital said he had opened his eyes that morning and spoken his first words. They said he was asking for his children. I ran out of class without even grabbing my books. George drove me and Tommy to the hospital, breaking every speed limit along the way. When we burst into my father's room, he was sitting up in bed. He looked thin and pale and fragile, nothing like the strong man I remembered. But his eyes were alive, his eyes were aware. He saw us and started to cry. I threw myself into his arms, sobbing, telling him everything that had happened. Tommy climbed onto the bed and buried his face in Dad's chest, crying that he had missed him, that he was so happy he was awake. It took a long time to explain everything. The accident, the coma, what Linda had done, finding the cabin, George, the lawyers, the money. Dad listened with growing horror and amazement, struggling to comprehend how much had changed while he was unconscious. When I got to the part about Grandpa Robert and the hidden fortune, Dad went very quiet. I could see the emotions playing across his face. Sadness that his father had never told him. Regret for all the years of struggling when there had been help waiting. But also something like wonder, like he couldn't quite believe that his children had somehow found their way to the exact place that could save them. He asked to see the letter. I had brought it with me, keeping it close like a talisman. I handed it to him and watched his face as he read his father's words for the first time. When he finished, he held the letter against his chest and closed his eyes. He said that his father had always promised to tell him something important when he grew up. He said that after his father died, he had always wondered what that something was. He said that now, 40 years later, he finally knew. The recovery process was long and difficult. Dad had to relearn how to walk. He had to rebuild the strength that months of lying in a hospital bed had stolen. He had good days and bad days, setbacks and breakthroughs. But through it all, we were together. That was the thing that mattered most. Once Dad was well enough to leave the hospital, we moved into a rented house near George's place. It was small but comfortable, and for the first time in years, it actually felt like home. No one was criticizing us or making us feel unwanted. No one was hiding their cruelty behind a fake smile. We were a family again. Dad officially divorced Linda about 6 months after he woke up. She didn't contest it, probably because she knew how badly she would look if the full story came out. She took whatever money was in their joint accounts and disappeared from our lives forever. I don't know where she went, and honestly, I don't care. The cabin became a special place for us. We kept the property and fixed it up over time, turning it from an abandoned wreck into a cozy retreat. We would go there on weekends and holidays, hiking through the same woods that Tommy and I had stumbled through on that desperate rainy night. Sometimes I would stand in the main room and look at the spot where we had huddled by the fire, 2 scared kids with nothing but each other and a rapidly dying phone. It was hard to believe that had only been a year ago. It felt like a lifetime. George became like a grandfather to us. He had never had children of his own, and he poured all the love he had into Tommy and me. He taught me to drive. He helped Tommy with his homework. He shared stories about our real grandfather, the man we had never known, making him real in a way that old photographs never could. When I turned 18, I gained access to the trust fund that Patricia had set up. By then, the remaining gold had been sold at favorable prices, and the old money had been exchanged for new. The total came to just over $2 million. I could have done anything with that money. I could have bought a fancy car or expensive clothes or all the things that teenagers are supposed to want, but none of that mattered to me. Instead, I did something that I think would have made my grandfather proud. I used part of the money to pay off Dad's hospital bills, which had piled up during his long recovery. I used another part to set up a college fund for Tommy, making sure he would never have to worry about affording an education. I invested the rest conservatively, following advice from a financial advisor that Patricia recommended. And I used a small amount to do something else, something personal. I tracked down the group home that Linda had threatened to send us to. The real one, not the imaginary threat, but a real facility for children without families. I visited and saw the conditions they were living in. The worn furniture, the overcrowded rooms, the look in those children's eyes, the same look that Tommy had worn when we were wandering the streets with nowhere to go. I made a donation, a significant one, enough to renovate the building, buy new supplies, hire more staff, enough to make a difference in the lives of children who had no one to fight for them. Because I knew what it was like to feel abandoned. I knew what it was like to think that no one in the world cared if you lived or died. And I knew that not everyone was lucky enough to stumble upon a magical cabin in the woods with a hidden fortune waiting inside. Sometimes you had to make your own magic. Sometimes you had to be the person who cared. Tommy grew up healthy and happy. He doesn't remember much about those terrible weeks we spent running and hiding, which I think is a blessing. To him, it's just a story that happened when he was little, something that ended well and doesn't need to cause him any pain. But I remember every moment. The fear and the cold and the hunger, the despair of watching Linda throw us away like garbage, the desperate hope when I pushed open that cabin door, the shock of finding the letter with our father's name on it, the tears when I opened the safe and realized we were going to be okay. I remember because I never want to forget. I never want to take for granted what we have. I never want to become someone who doesn't appreciate the second chance we were given. Dad remarried a few years later. Her name is Susan, and she is nothing like Linda. She is kind and patient and loving. She treats Tommy and me like her own children, and she makes Dad happier than I've seen him since Mom was alive. I danced at their wedding and felt no jealousy, no resentment, just genuine joy that my father had found someone worthy of him. George passed away when I was 23. He went peacefully in his sleep, the way he always said he wanted to go. We buried him in the little cemetery near the cabin, next to the grave of my grandfather. Two friends, reunited after all those years. I inherited his house, which I kept. Not because I needed another property, but because it held so many memories. The room where Tommy and I had slept after weeks of uncertainty. The kitchen where George had made us pancakes every Saturday morning. The workshop where he had taught me to build things with my hands. I turned it into a refuge for young people agging out of foster care. A place where they could stay while they got on their feet, with support and guidance and someone who actually cared about their future. I named it after my mother, the Sarah Miller House. George's last name with my mother's first name. It felt right. I'm 32 now. I have a career I love, working as a social worker helping families in crisis. I have a husband who supports me and challenges me and makes me laugh. I have 2 children of my own, a girl named after my mother and a boy named after my grandfather. Tommy is 23, just finished college, about to start his own life. He's studying to be a teacher because he wants to help kids the way I helped him. He visits the cabin whenever he can, sometimes bringing friends, sometimes going alone just to sit in the quiet and think. Dad is retired now, living in a little house by the beach with Susan. They travel, they garden, they spoil their grandchildren shamelessly. He still gets emotional sometimes when he talks about those months in the coma, all the things he missed, all the things that happened while he was lost in the dark. But he's made peace with it. We all have. And the cabin still stands. It's not abandoned anymore, hasn't been for years. But it's still a retreat, still a place apart from the world. We gather there for holidays and birthdays, filling those rooms with the noise of children and the smell of cooking food and the warmth of a family that almost didn't survive. Sometimes, late at night, when everyone else is asleep, I'll go down to the cellar. I'll stand in the spot where I found the safe and the letter, and I'll think about everything that had to happen to bring me to that moment. The chain of events stretching back decades, my grandfather hiding his fortune, my mother getting sick, my father remarrying the wrong woman, the accident, Linda's cruelty, our desperate flight through the rain. If any single link in that chain had been different, I would never have found the cabin. I would never have known about my grandfather's secret. Tommy and I might have ended up in the foster system, separated, lost. Our whole lives would have been different. But every link held, every piece fell into place, and here we are. I don't know if it was fate or luck or something else entirely. I don't know if there's some grand design to the universe, or if we're all just bouncing around randomly until we die. Those are questions for philosophers and theologians, not for me. What I know is this. On the worst day of my life, when everything was falling apart and I had no hope left, I found a cabin in the woods, and that cabin changed everything. It gave us shelter when we had none. It gave us wealth when we had nothing. It connected us to a grandfather we had never known and a past we had never imagined. It brought George into our lives, a friend and mentor and surrogate family member. It gave us the resources to rebuild after our world had been shattered. But more than all of that, it taught me something that I carry with me every single day. It taught me that even when things seem darkest, even when you feel completely alone, there is always hope. Not the vague, wishful kind of hope that doesn't mean anything, but real hope. Tangible hope. The kind that hides in abandoned cabins and old letters and the kindness of strangers. You just have to keep going long enough to find it. When Linda threw us out that morning, I thought our lives were over. I thought we would never recover, never be happy again, never have a home or a family or a future. I was 16 years old and terrified, and I couldn't see any way forward. But I kept walking anyway, through the rain and the cold and the fear. I kept walking, kept searching, kept hopping even when hope seemed foolish. And eventually I found the door, and I pushed it open, and everything changed. That's my story. The story of how my little brother and I were thrown out by our stepmother and found an abandoned cabin that changed our lives forever. It's not a fairy tale, even though it sounds like one. It's real and messy and complicated, full of pain and loss and struggles that I wouldn't wish on anyone. But it's also full of love and kindness and impossible second chances. That's life, I think, not all good or all bad, but a complicated mix of both. The trick is to keep going through the bad parts long enough to reach the good ones. To never give up, even when giving up seems like the only rational option. Because you never know what's waiting for you on the other side of that next door. You never know what might change everything. Looking back now from the comfortable distance of years and perspective, I can see how fragile it all was. How easily things could have gone differently. If we had turned left instead of right on that rainy night. If the cabin had been truly empty without the cellar or the safe. If George had decided not to investigate the smoke he saw rising from the trees. If any of 1,000 tiny factors had been different. But they weren't different. They were exactly what they needed to be, at exactly the moment they needed to be. And here I am, telling you this story, hoping that maybe it helps someone else who is going through their own dark night. To anyone out there who feels lost, who feels abandoned, who feels like there's no way forward, keep walking, keep searching, keep hopping. Your cabin is out there somewhere, your door is waiting to be opened. You just have to find it. And you will, I believe that with my whole heart. You will. People often ask me if I ever went back to see Linda. If I ever confronted her, demanded an explanation, tried to understand why she did what she did. The answer is no. I never saw her again after the divorce, never tried to contact her, never wanted to know what became of her. Some people would call that cowardly or unresolved. I call it healthy boundaries. Linda made her choices. She decided that 2 children in her care were inconvenient, and she got rid of them without a second thought about what would happen to us. Nothing she could say would change that. No apology could undo the trauma, the fear, the months of uncertainty. So I let her go. I released her from my mind and my heart, not because she deserved forgiveness, but because carrying hatred is exhausting. Because my energy was better spent building a good life than mourning the cruelty of someone who had never deserved our trust. The same people ask me if I'm angry at my father for not protecting us, for marrying Linda in the first place, for not seeing what she was really like. That one is more complicated. Yes, there were moments of anger. Moments when I wondered how he could have been so blind, so desperate for companionship that he ignored the obvious warning signs. Moments when I resented him for bringing that woman into our lives and not believing me when I tried to tell him the truth. But those moments passed, because I also understood. I understood the loneliness of losing the person you love most in the world. I understood the desperate need for connection, for partnership, for someone to share the burden of life with. I understood how grief can cloud your judgment and make you see what you want to see. Dad was human, he made mistakes. But he also loved us more than anything, and when he woke up from his coma and learned what had happened, he was devastated. He apologized over and over, tears streaming down his face, begging us to forgive him for not protecting us. How could I hold on to anger in the face of that? We forgave him, of course we did. He was our father and he needed us as much as we needed him. That's another thing I learned from this whole experience. Forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about you. It's about releasing the weight of anger and resentment so you can move forward with your life. Some wounds heal, some don't, but you don't have to let them define you. The cabin taught me that too. All those years it sat abandoned in the woods, slowly decaying, holding on to its secrets. It could have collapsed completely. It could have been consumed by the forest, disappearing back into nature as if it had never existed. But it didn't, it held on, it survived. And when we needed it, when we stumbled through that door desperate and afraid, it was still standing. Sometimes survival is its own kind of victory. Sometimes just enduring is enough. I think about my grandfather a lot these days. The man I never met, whose foresight and planning saved his grandchildren decades after his death. I wonder what he would think if he could see us now, if he would be proud of what we've built, of how we've lived. I like to think he would be. I like to think that somewhere, somehow he knows. The letter he wrote said he wanted to ensure his family would be taken care of if everything went wrong. He couldn't have imagined the specific way things would go wrong, the stepmother and the accident and the abandonment. But he prepared anyway. He left a safety net, hidden in the woods, waiting patiently for someone who needed it. We needed it, and it was there. That's the kind of person I try to be now. The kind who prepares for bad times even when things are good. The kind who leaves safety nets for people I may never meet. The kind who pays forward the incredible luck I received. Because that's what it was, wasn't it? Luck. Chance. The random intersection of circumstances that put me on that specific path on that specific night. But it was also more than that. It was also choice. The choice to keep walking when I wanted to give up. The choice to open that door instead of passing by. The choice to explore the cellar instead of ignoring it. The choice to trust George when every instinct told me to run. Luck gives you opportunities. Choice determines what you do with them. I made good choices mostly. When it mattered most, when Tommy was depending on me and our lives hung in the balance, I made the right calls. Not perfect ones, but good enough. That's another thing I've learned. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be good enough. You just have to keep trying, keep pushing, keep reaching for something better. And sometimes, if you're lucky and you make good choices, you find a cabin in the woods that changes everything. I hope this story stays with you. I hope that if you're ever in a dark place, feeling lost and alone and hopeless, you remember the girl who walked through the rain with her little brother, not knowing where she was going, only knowing that she had to keep going. I hope you find your cabin, I hope you open that door. And I hope that what's inside changes everything. Because it can happen, it happened to me. And it can happen to you too. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for giving me the space to share something so personal, so painful, so ultimately beautiful. Until next time, keep walking, keep searching, keep hopping.